June 2022. A gymnasium in Brandenburg, under Havel, Germany, converted into a makeshift courtroom because no regular courtroom could handle the media. A man is wheeled in. He's 101 years old. He covers his face with a folder so the cameras can't get a clean shot. His lawyer stands beside him. And in a few minutes, a judge is going to tell this man something almost nobody alive has ever been told in a German courtroom. That's 77 years after the war ended, 77 years after he told his neighbors, his children, his entire town that he spent the war as a farm laborer. He is guilty. Guilty of being an accessory to the murder of 3,518 human beings. And here's the part that should bother you. For nearly 8 decades, he wasn't hiding in a jungle in South America. He wasn't living under a fake passport in Argentina. He was farming a plot of land less than 60 miles from the camp where he stood guard, hiding in plain sight, in his own name, in his own country. And nobody came for him until he was almost too old to remember his own crimes. Most people assume the story of Nazi justice ended in the 1940s and 50s. Nuremberg, the trials, the hangings, case closed. That assumption is wrong, and it's wrong by decades. The truth is that the overwhelming majority of the men who ran Hitler's camp system, the guards, the clerks, the men who opened the gas chamber doors and swept up afterward, never spent a single day in prison. They went home. They got jobs. Some of them became exactly what this story is about. Farmers. Ordinary, sunburned, calloused-handed farmers who spent the next 40, 50, 60 years of their lives tending fields a short drive from where they had once tended a different kind of machine. And the man in that gymnasium in 2022 is one of the last of them ever caught. His name, according to German court records, was Josef Schütz. Before we go further, you need to understand who Josef Schütz was before any of this. He wasn't a monster from central casting. He wasn't an SS officer with a skull on his cap barking orders in a black and white newsreel. He was a teenager from a farming family, the kind of young man who, in any other decade, would have lived and died completely unremarkable. Born in 1921 in what's now Lithuania, raised around livestock and crop rotations, no particular ideology, no particular hatred that anyone on record ever described. And that's exactly the point. That's the part that should unsettle you more than any villain ever could. The machine that ran the Holocaust wasn't built exclusively from fanatics. It was staffed, in huge numbers, by boys who just did what they were told, and then went home afterward and told themselves it didn't count. By the early 1940s, Josef Schütz was wearing the uniform of the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, the branch specifically responsible for guarding concentration camps. His posting, Sachsenhausen. If you don't know Sachsenhausen by name, you should. It sat just north of Berlin, close enough that senior Nazi officials could visit for the afternoon. Over its operational life, it held more than 200,000 prisoners, political dissidents, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexual men, Roma families, Jews. Prosecutors would later determine that during the roughly 3 years Schütz served there, thousands of prisoners died under conditions his post directly enabled: starvation, disease, executions, and, this is the detail that gets people every time, mass shootings carried out using a specially engineered measuring device. Prisoners were told they were having their height checked for medical records. Instead, a guard behind a hidden partition shot them in the back of the neck. Schütz's watchtower overlooked the exact section of camp where this happened, for years. Now hold on to that fact, because it's going to matter again later when a defense attorney stands up in 2022 and tries to argue his client couldn't possibly have known what was happening a few dozen meters from where he stood guard, 12 hours a day, for 3 years. When the war ended in May 1945, something happened that almost nobody teaches in school. The vast majority of camp guards simply walked away. Not all of them. Not the commandants, not the doctors who ran experiments, not the men whose faces ended up on wanted posters, but the rank and file, the watchtower men, the perimeter guards, the ones who processed intake and stood over roll call. Most of them melted straight back into civilian populations within months. Germany in 1945 was chaos. Records were burned. Files were scattered across a country, being carved up by 4 occupying armies. The Allies ran a denazification program, but it was overwhelmed almost immediately. Millions of Germans had some connection to the Nazi Party, and there weren't enough investigators, courts, or years in a human lifetime to process them all. So a triage happened, whether anyone officially admitted it or not. The big fish got hunted. The small fish got questionnaires, a rubber stamp, and a train ticket home. Josef Schütz was one of the small fish. According to his own later testimony, he spent time in a Soviet prisoner of war camp after the German surrender, itself a brutal experience that killed enormous numbers of captured German soldiers. He was eventually released. And then he did something that hundreds, maybe thousands, of former camp personnel did in the exact same years. He went back to farming. Quiet work, physical work, the kind of work that doesn't ask questions about where you spent 1942 through 1945, because everyone in a farming village in post-war Germany had a war they didn't talk about. He later moved and settled, worked as a farm laborer, and eventually a locksmith, married, built an ordinary German life. For close to 8 decades, if you'd asked anyone who knew him, they would have told you he was exactly what he told them he was, a man who spent the war working the land. Here's the number that should genuinely disturb you. Historians estimate that around 6,000 men served as SS guards at Sachsenhausen alone over the life of that single camp. Multiply that by every camp in the Nazi system: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, Stutthof, Ravensbrück, dozens more, and you're looking at tens of thousands of men who performed exactly this kind of role. By the time serious legal reckoning caught up with any of them, fewer than a few hundred were ever tried in West Germany for camp-related crimes in the decades immediately after the war. Do the math on that ratio. It's not close. The overwhelming majority lived, worked, raised children, and died as free men. And the legal reason why is almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. For decades, West German law required something specific to convict a former camp guard. Prosecutors had to prove direct, individual participation in a specific killing. Not, he stood guard at a death camp. Not, he was part of the system that murdered hundreds of thousands. They needed a name, a date, a body, and proof that this particular guard pulled this particular trigger or opened this particular valve. In the chaos of a destroyed, half-burned wartime paper trail, that standard was nearly impossible to meet for the low-ranking men. The ones who didn't sign orders, didn't run the crematoria, just stood in towers with rifles. Prosecutors knew these men had been complicit in something monstrous. They just couldn't clear the legal bar the law demanded. Case after case was quietly closed. Investigators built files, then watched them gather dust in an archive in a small town called Ludwigsburg, home to West Germany's Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, an agency created in 1958 specifically to hunt these men down, and one that spent decades hitting the exact same legal wall over and over. So how do you explain a 101-year-old man standing trial in 2022? What changed? One single case changed everything, and it happened just over a decade before Schütz's trial. His name was John Demjanjuk, a former Sobibor camp guard who'd been living an entirely unremarkable post-war life as an auto worker in Ohio, in the United States, for decades before investigators caught up to him. In 2011, a Munich court convicted Demjanjuk using a radically different legal theory, that simply serving as a guard at a camp built for one purpose, mass murder, was itself sufficient to convict someone as an accessory, even without proof he personally pulled a trigger. No specific victim, no specific date, just presence and purpose. That ruling detonated through Germany's legal system. Suddenly, files that had sat sealed in Ludwigsburg for half a century were reopened. Investigators went back through camp rosters. They cross-referenced names against pension records, against residency databases, against the ordinary bureaucratic paper trail that every citizen leaves behind simply by living an ordinary life. And that's exactly how they found him. Not through a tip from a survivor, not through a defector's confession, through paperwork, a pension file with a birth date and a place of birth that matched an SS guard roster from Sachsenhausen sitting in an archive waiting for someone to finally cross-reference it against a database that hadn't existed in a usable form a generation earlier. Now picture this from the other side. Picture being 90-something years old, having spent 70 years as a farmer and a locksmith, a grandfather, a fixture in your community, and then one day a letter arrives, or investigators show up at your door. Neighbors in these cases, again and again, told the exact same story to journalists. We had no idea. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He talked about crops, about the weather, about his tools. Nobody ever heard him say a word about the war. And that silence, that decades-long, disciplined, total silence, wasn't an accident. It was survival strategy, whether he ever consciously framed it that way or not. Say nothing, ask for nothing, draw no attention, become the most boring man in the village. It worked, for 77 years, right up until a records clerk in Ludwigsburg found a match. The trial itself, when it finally happened in 2022, revealed exactly how thin the wall between ordinary life and war crime really was. Prosecutors laid out documentary evidence, SS personnel records bearing his name, his birth date, his birthplace, tracing his assignment to Sachsenhausen across 3 specific years. Josef Schütz, for his part, denied everything, insisting from the witness stand that he had never been a camp guard at all, repeating the same cover story he'd apparently told for decades, that he'd simply worked as a farm laborer during those exact years. The court didn't buy it. The documentary trail was too specific, too consistent, too corroborated by camp records that had survived the war intact. The judge told him plainly that his own actions had supported a machine of mass extermination, that he had personally witnessed people tortured and murdered under his watch for 3 straight years. 5 years, that was the sentence. The oldest person in German history ever tried for Holocaust-era crimes, standing in a converted gymnasium at 101 years old, finally hearing the word guilty attached to a summer job he'd spent 77 years insisting never happened. But here's the twist that most people miss entirely, the part that turns this from one man's story into something much bigger. Schütz wasn't an isolated case. He was the last domino in a chain that had been falling for over a decade. In 2020, a former Stutthof camp guard named Bruno Day was convicted at 93 years old and given a suspended sentence. Oskar Gröning, the so-called bookkeeper of Auschwitz, was convicted in 2015 on 300,000 counts of accessory to murder. 300,000, one for every person deported to Auschwitz during the specific months he worked there processing their stolen belongings, and died before serving any real time. Reinhold Hanning, another Auschwitz guard, convicted the same year at 94, also died before imprisonment. A 96-year-old former camp secretary in the town of Itzehoe actually fled her own trial hours before it began in 2022, was tracked down and arrested within the day, and was ultimately convicted too. Do you see the pattern? Every single one of these people lived free for the majority of a human lifetime. Every single one was elderly, often too frail to ever serve real prison time, which raises an uncomfortable question that historians and prosecutors argue about to this day. What is justice worth, 77 years late, delivered to a man in a wheelchair who will die of natural causes before finishing his sentence? And that question cuts even deeper when you consider who was watching these trials: survivors, a dwindling, aging handful of actual Sachsenhausen survivors, into their 90s, and hundreds themselves, some of whom traveled specifically to sit in that gymnasium and watch. One survivor's family member said afterward that the verdict mattered less as punishment and more as confirmation, a formal, legal, undeniable record that what happened, happened, and that the machine had names attached to it, not just abstractions. Because that's the other war being fought in these final trials, a race against time, not just to punish the last living perpetrators, but to build an unbreakable documentary record before every single witness, guard, and survivor from that era is gone forever. Every one of these cases closes a door that will never open again. There will be no trials of Sachsenhausen guards in 2040. There won't be anyone left to try. Which brings us to the number that should really sit with you. Historians estimate that of the roughly 6,000 men who served as guards at Sachsenhausen alone, only a small handful, barely more than a dozen across the entire post-war era, were ever convicted for crimes committed there. A dozen out of 6,000 at a single camp. Multiply that ratio across every camp in the system and you start to understand the actual scale of what didn't happen after the war. Not tens of thousands of trials, not thousands. A small number of aging men, caught almost entirely by accident, decades after any conventional statute of limitations should have made prosecution impossible, saved only by one legal precedent set in a Munich courtroom in 2011 involving an Ohio auto worker who used to be a guard at Sobibor. Josef Schütz died in April 2023, less than a year after his conviction, at the age of 102. He never served a day of his 5-year sentence. His appeal was still pending when he passed. And somewhere in that same country, right now, German investigators at that same office in Ludwigsburg are still working, still cross-referencing pension files, still running old SS rosters against modern residency databases, hunting for the handful of names that might still be alive, still farming some quiet plot of land, still telling their grandchildren a story about the war that isn't true. As of the last count made public, prosecutors were still actively pursuing new cases involving suspects in their late 90s and beyond, men and women whose files sat untouched for half a century, waiting for someone to finally open the drawer. The war ended in 1945. The last trial hasn't happened yet.